Welcome to the Story Learning Podcast, regular doses of language learning tips and motivation to help you become fluent in any language. With me, Olly Richards. For language programs, books, free resources, and much more, visit StoryLearning.com.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the show. This is episode 87, closing in fast on episode 100. And yeah, I'm here in London right now. Don't know if any of you guys are in London. Maybe if you are in London, get in touch because we're running lots of cool language events at the moment. So maybe shoot me an email and let me know, and I can give you some more information. But it's a beautiful day, and I'm here recording some more podcasts for you guys, which is super cool. And we've got an amazing question today, which I could talk about for about 7 million years, but I'm not going to. You'll be pleased to hear. Now, without any further ado, let's jump into today's question from Pete.
Hi Ollie, Pete here from Manchester. I just want to start by saying love the podcast and I find it really motivational. So I'm learning Portuguese, and one bit of advice I've seen come about a few times is to try and get out of the habit of translating things in your head. So I've been watching a lot more TV shows and movies in Portuguese language, but I'm a bit unsure as to whether I should be watching them with English subtitles, but obviously I have the fear of translating, or should I be watching it in Portuguese subtitles so I can see what they're saying. Also, have you got any other little tips to avoid the habit of translating, or is this a thing that mainly comes out of getting better in the language? Thank you.
Hi Pete, thanks for the compliments on the show, and thanks for a super cool question. Wow, I mean, it's one of those questions that is so huge that I really could write a whole book about it, I think. But yeah, so how to condense this into one podcast episode? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this down into two parts. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about the question of translating in your head. And then in the next episode, I'm going to talk about movies and subtitles, because it's a very kind of different, well, it's very much related, but also a big topic in its own right. So I'm going to start by talking about this question of how to stop translating in your head. Now, this is something you hear a lot, isn't it? Don't translate in your head. For me, translation is inevitable. Translation is inevitable, and I don't think it's smart to try and avoid it, because, look, if you don't know what's being said in the language you're learning, what are you going to do? Just, ignore it? You're going to try to understand, right? And the only way that we can understand something that we don't know is to translate it into English, or to try to do that, and to, give it our best shot. So translation is inevitable because language is about communication. If you have any interest whatsoever in understanding what's being said, you're going to translate. So I don't think that there's a particular need to avoid translation. I mean, certainly when I start learning a new language, I translate everything. I have to, because I have to understand how the language works, right? If you're learning a very new and different language, translating into your mother tongue, it helps you do this kind of contrastive analysis, as they say, and it helps you understand the mechanics. Okay, so in English, it's subject, verb, object, and look, in Chinese, it's also subject, verb, object, and that's really, really helpful. So when you get people saying, okay, don't translate in your head when you're speaking or when you're listening, well, I think they're talking about something different, and that advice in itself, don't translate in your head, or try to avoid translating, the sentiments, the intentions are good, but it's not very helpful advice, I don't find, because, how are you supposed to stop? There's no magic pill you can take to stop translating. So let's break this down a little bit and see how we can move from a place where we're translating everything to a place where we're not translating, because it does happen, but it happens slowly and it happens over time. So behind this point, behind this topic, this big question of how to stop translating, is this: that in order to stop translating, you need to be able to deal with your target language for what it is, and not look for the logical relation in English. All right? So what that means is, if you're listening to Portuguese, for example, Pete, and then you hear something, you need to move gradually to a place where you accept that for what it is. The grammar that's being used, the phrases or the verb patterns, whatever. You hear those words being spoken, and you take that for what it is, and your automatic reaction is not to translate that into English and see what they're saying in English, if you like. All right, so that's the kind of bigger picture aim. But like we said at the beginning, translating is inevitable. It's probably a good thing. So like this question becomes important as we're progressing, as we're moving into a higher level in the language. And the reason is because like these comparisons with English stop becoming useful, because as you get better at Portuguese, or I mean this applies to any language obviously, what you find is that you don't so much need to learn the basic grammar anymore, but you need to learn the nuances of the language and the little tricks and little words and phrases and inflections in the language that give it colour and give it meaning. And that's the point where translating into English stops becoming useful, because there isn't a direct translation. You see this all over the language. I mean, even like in Portuguese at a very basic level with a word like saudade. Like, yeah, you can translate that into English, but not in a good way. There's no good translation of saudade. So, like, yeah, it happens throughout, but especially as you get into a more advanced level. And so what you got to do is take every kind of word and phrase and inflection as it comes, and try to analyze that and understand that for what it is, and look out for that in different places. So it happens gradually, and it's not something that you can force. But the key things, I think, like as I was preparing this, I was sort of thinking back over the last few languages that I've learned, and they've been Japanese, Cantonese, and Arabic, and all extremely different to English. Like, you can't get more different languages to English than Japanese, for example, or Arabic. It's very, very different. And so I was sort of thinking back and thinking, well, at what point did I stop translating? And yeah, at the beginning, everything that's said, I'm translating almost word for word into English. But very quickly, once I've got past this point of like basic communication, which I guess you're probably at, Pete, with your Portuguese because you're watching movies, and I don't know, I imagine that you are not a complete beginner. I may be wrong about that, but assuming you've been studying for a while, the key mind shift you need is to learn to live with ambiguity. All right? To learn to live with ambiguity. And that means that you can't insist on understanding every word in the language, every word that you hear. You just can't, because it slows you down. There's too much, like when you insist on understanding every word, like that stops you focusing on the bigger picture. So you need to learn to live with it and be happy with a certain amount of ambiguity. And I think in all my languages, like, there's always things I don't understand when I'm speaking with someone. There's always stuff I don't understand. But I think one of my strengths is that I'm able to look above the kind of word level, or even the sentence level, and focus on the higher communication. And if there's stuff that I don't understand, words, or even sometimes complete sentences I don't understand, I don't let that bother me. I focus on, as best I can, continuing the conversation. I think that's one of my strengths as a language learner. I think that's what helps me to really kind of start communicating words. I don't fixate on every single word. So what that means in practice for you is that you need to be studying. You need to be doing things like reading textbooks and dialogues, looking at the grammar explanations, and looking out for patterns. Every language has got patterns which are used throughout. And what you've got to do is, as you're studying, whether that's in a textbook or whether you're just making notes from your speaking sessions or your lessons, you need to be on the lookout for interesting patterns in the language, like grammar patterns, maybe certain words that go together, phrases that are commonly used. Be on the lookout for those. And really, your job is to just notice them. All right? You notice these different patterns being used in the language and start to see them being used in different places. All right? So you might learn a phrase in a textbook, and then you might hear it being said later on when you're watching a movie. This happens all the time. And like, one of the key skills of a successful language learner is to be able to notice. So notice stuff that's being used, and then notice it being applied in different places. And once you start to see something being used across a different, from in your textbook, and then in conversation, and then in a movie, then start to try to use it yourself. And then what happens is you kind of gradually, you don't need to understand it necessarily, but just start to notice it. And then just by paying attention to those things, it will gradually start to sort of infiltrate into your common vocabulary and your knowledge of the language, and you'll start to absorb it. Not overnight, but it will happen. And obviously, there's a lot to learn in a language, and so this is a gradual process, one word at a time, one phrase at a time, one grammar pattern at a time. What your job is just to keep that up, keep noticing, keep being observant, keep being curious about the language that's being used. And in most cases, the most the best environment to do that is when you're studying with a textbook, because it's controlled. You can slow it down, you can listen again to the audio, you can read the explanations. So textbooks are a great place to get that kind of foundation of different parts of the language. Something else is to always make sure that you're dealing in phrases or even complete sentences and not in words. Okay, a lot of people, again, this comes back to the translation thing of not fixating on words, because there are too many of them. All right, fixate on the sentence level, on the phrase level. Learn complete phrases and sentences. If you hear something cool in a movie, learn the complete phrase. Don't just learn the word. That's going to help you ensure that you're always seeing the bigger picture and not being too micro. Again, when you get these patterns, write them down. I like putting these in my flashcards so that I can always go back to them and revise them. And again, just try to notice how they're being used in different places. And then, when you're doing things like watching movies, I always like to say that you've got your study time and you've got your downtime, right? So when you're studying, then go through it in depth, look for these different grammar patterns, study the stuff. But then when you're watching a movie, this is not study time, okay? This is downtime. So just relax, enjoy it, turn off the subtitles, and certainly the English subtitles, turn them off, and just let your brain soak it up and take it in, all right? There's too much in a movie for you to understand everything. There's too much going on. So what you need to do is to just, again, be present with the language, be mindful of the language that's being used, notice it. Don't worry if you don't understand everything. It's totally cool. But a movie is not a good thing to use as a study base, all right? It's good for exposure to the language. So just, by all means, watch movies every night, but chill out, relax, and just let the language kind of infiltrate your brain and take over your mind. And that's how you begin the process of stopping to translate and just knowing the language for what it is. And then the last thing I'd say is spend as much time on all 4 skills as you can. So if you find yourself always watching movies, then do something different. If you find yourself always studying textbooks, do something different. If you only ever speak, do something different. Try to use all 4 skills, and what that does is it's going to increase the likelihood of you noticing these new verbs and grammar patterns and phrases in different contexts. And that's what ultimately helps you start to own the language and not translate everything. All right, so wow, that was quite a heavy answer. I hope that was useful, Pete. Again, there's no quick solution, but that's the mentality you need over the long term to get over the translation problem. So cool, hope that was helpful. If you would like to ask me a question, please do. I love getting your questions, and you can go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/ask in order to do that. Now, at the end of every episode, I like to leave you with something on the topic of the show, and today I'm going to give you a quote that I think I used this right at the beginning of one of the first episodes from Katsumoto, who's a great Japanese language blogger. He's actually American, but and he said, "You don't learn a language, you get used to it." And this is perfect to illustrate this whole question of translation. You don't learn it, you just get used to it, and over time, it becomes yours. The language becomes yours. All right, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you back in the next episode for part 2 of Pete's question about learning, not translating, and more, okay, I'm rambling now. Next episode is going to be all about movies and how to avoid, or rather, how best to use subtitles with movies. See you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to today's episode, and in case you didn't already know, I teach languages in a rather unusual way through stories. Now, stories are a great way to learn a new language because when you're engrossed in a story, you remember things more easily, and the mechanics of the language just start clicking inside your brain. It's quite something, and if you'd like to find out how you can learn a new language or improve your skills in a language that you already know and do it with the power of stories, then you should check out my free Story Learning Kit, which will teach you exactly how this method works and how you can use it yourself to learn a new language. Visit storylearning.com/podkit. That's PODKIT to get free access. Inside, you'll find explanatory videos, masterclasses, worksheets, short stories to practice with, and much, much more. Once again, that is storylearning.com/podkit, PODKIT. And if you're lucky, you might also find a link in the podcast description or show notes of this episode.